Welcome to episode number 12 of Colorado TechCast.
So CTO Connection is a community for engineering leaders where they can connect with and learn from their peers. The idea is that where do you go? If you're an engineering leader, you probably grew up into it from becoming a really good software developer, and then somebody said, hey, you should go manage a team. And before you know it, you're a VP of engineering or an engineering director or a CTO. But how do you learn how to be good at management and understanding project development, all the kind of components that go into becoming a successful builder of organizations?
Hey everyone, this is Trapper from Colorado TechCast, the show that tells the stories of Colorado technology entrepreneurs and the companies that they're building. To hear new episodes of this program, go to our website at coloradotechcast.com. There you'll find everything you need to know to subscribe to the show, with links to iTunes, SoundCloud, and everything else we talk about on the program. On this episode, I'm speaking with Peter Bell, a transplant from New York with a long history in technology education. Peter's latest venture is CTO Connection. What started off as a series of day-long, single-track summits has transformed into a community of technology leaders who come together not only to share technology ideas, but transformational leadership ideas. Peter talks about his inspiration for building CTO Connection, the future of that on the Front Range, as well as share some technology gossip. I had a really good time talking with Peter, and I hope you enjoy listening as well. Now let's get started.
Trapper, thank you so much for having me. Excited to speak with you today.
Yeah, likewise, Peter. So I'm excited to learn about CTO Connection, but first tell me more about your background and how you got started.
So I did a few different things. I'm 47 years old, so I've been doing things for a while now. I started with a degree in computer engineering, so a very technical background. But then I wanted to see what the real world was like, so I did everything from motivational speaking to advertising sales to even becoming briefly a psychotherapist before I settled back into starting to write software, build engineering teams, and teach people how to code, which is how I've spent the last 20 years. In terms of getting out to Boulder, Colorado, I was in New York City for 15 years. It's an amazing city and a wonderful place to build businesses and build a life. But I was ready to change my pace of life and quality of life. And I knew that I'd never be able to afford the kind of life that I wanted in New York City. And quite frankly, even with unlimited money, it's kind of hard to get a quarter acre in Manhattan. And to try jogging from any place in Manhattan to the mountains is not an easy thing to do. Just under 2 years ago, moved out with my wife, and then shortly after that, we had a young son and moved to Boulder, Colorado. And it's been amazing because you have the best of New York or San Francisco or Austin or Boston in terms of a vibrant tech scene, lots of new startups, lots of really smart and interesting programmers. But you also get 300 sunny days a year. It's a 20-minute drive to Eldora and just learning to snowboard after having not been on any kind of snow for over 20 years. And it's a place where you can kind of take the time to take a breath and really build the kind of businesses and opportunities that you want for your life. So I've been having a wonderful time out here in Colorado.
So how does the technology community in Colorado compare to the technology community in New York?
It's different. The interesting thing was by the time I was leaving New York just under 2 years ago, the tech scene was almost overwhelming. I'd been there back in the early days when there were barely any meetups, and in fact, when meetup.com didn't even exist. And it had got to the point where in any given evening, even if you attended 3 or 4 events, you were missing another 4 or 5 you really should have been at. So I was getting to the point where I was presenting 3, 4, 5 times a week and still feeling like I was missing most of the things I had to do. There's no question that especially between, if you go up and down the Front Range, especially between like Boulder and the US 36 corridor and down to Denver, you could probably keep yourself just as busy. But the communities in Colorado feel more right-sized. There's never, if I ever want to go out and learn about a particular programming language or talk with a bunch of entrepreneurs, there's always something I can do that week that will make me happy and engaged. But I don't feel like I'm missing out on things if I'm not attending 10 events a week. And for me, that felt much more sustainable, especially as you've got to bear in mind that if you are choosing to build a company, at some point in time, you've got to get beyond all the startup meetups and actually go do the work on the business. So I feel like this is a much better place to be able to focus on building a business And then, of course, it's very, very easy to do business across the country or across the world, irrespective of what your local market happens to be.
Two things that I found exciting about the technology community in Colorado is, one, how tight-knit it is. It doesn't take attending too many events, too many meetups before you start running into the same person over and over and just gradually building out your network that way. And two, the number of events going on. Whether it's meetups or built-in brews or events that the Colorado Technology Association puts on, there's always something to do.
And I feel also that there is a shared sense of connection and community, because broadly there are the Colorado natives. I'd say maybe there's three parts to the community. There's the Colorado natives who are born and brought up here, which create the foundation and the culture into which we're all coming. Then there are the kind of Midwestern and, we're coming in from Ohio, wanting somewhere a little more exciting, both personally and professionally. And then you have the coastal refugees coming in, especially from San Francisco and New York City, who want to be able to have some kind of quality of life while still building amazing technology and businesses. And I really like that interplay. So, for example, it's hard if you have a get together, somebody in the room is going to have just left San Francisco and have VC contacts there if you need to have that discussion. But it's much more accessible than if you were to meet them 2 years ago when they were living in San Francisco.
It seems more coastal companies are opening up satellite offices all along the Front Range. I don't know if it's a combination of talent and housing prices that's kind of leading that, but I'm encouraged to see more companies move here. The Bay Area has much longer history in venture capitalism and building large companies that really scale. And I think that's something positive that the community here can learn from.
And in fact, I think it's a magical melting point, because a few years ago, there was no question if you wanted to build the next Twitter or Uber, there was a real story. And I think there still is to some extent. If you really have to be the next multi-billion-dollar business, there is such a concentration of talent, wealth, and opportunity in and around San Francisco and Silicon Valley that it's hard to beat that. And equally, if you're really excited about building a financial technology, a fintech company, there's no question that you're going to be closer to more of your customers if you do that in New York City. But what's interesting is it used to be really hard to build consumer businesses in New York because we just didn't have the product managers who knew what they were doing. It used to be harder to do fintech on the West Coast because you didn't have access to the clients. And what's lovely is here in Colorado, there's this now wonderful melting pot of people coming from all those backgrounds, plus the kind of indigenous community that allows us all, I think, to build better and more interesting businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. More diversity in thought drives more diversity in businesses. So now tell me about CTO Connection.
So CTO Connection is a community for engineering leaders where they can connect with and learn from their peers. The idea is that where do you go? If you're an engineering leader, you probably grew up into it from becoming a really good software developer, and then somebody said, hey, you should go manage a team. And before you know it, you're a VP of engineering or an engineering director or a CTO. But how do you learn how to be good at management and understanding project development, all the kind of components that go into becoming a successful builder of organizations? And right now, there's no single place where you can go to do that. So I actually started this. The first thing I did was I co-founded a CTO School in New York City back in 2011 for engineers who wanted to become engineering leaders. Then I started running a series of summits in 2014 where engineering leaders could connect with and learn from their peers. And we got CTOs of companies like MongoDB and Warby Parker and Stripe and a bunch of other great tech companies. And we got them all in a room and created a space where engineering leaders could continue to figure out how to get better at what they're doing. And now what we do is we now have a combination of schools around the world, summits in New York, San Francisco, and then later this year, we're going to be doing Austin, Chicago, and somewhere in the Front Range area, somewhere between Denver and Boulder. And we are also building an online community where people can really build these kind of lifelong connections so that they can get mentors and mentees, they can see job opportunities, and they can build communities of interest around the specific technologies or problems that they're trying to figure out as they build their engineering teams.
I think the communities are really critical to the future success of technology in Colorado. As you mentioned, the fintech companies have a solid footing in New York, and the Bay Area companies can just really churn out massive companies that really scale. Yeah, other than telecom companies, Denver doesn't really seem to have that known presence for any one particular thing. But I think as the community continues to grow, one thing will lead to another. And, maybe one day we'll be known for one of those things.
Yeah, I think there's really two components to it. One is, so for example, one of the ways I monetize the CTO Connection is we build mastermind groups where we will take groups of 5 to 8 engineering leaders, potentially from different places, and they do a 90-minute call twice a month talking about their hardest problems. And it's a real opportunity to build a high-trust peer group where you can answer the issues that you might not be comfortable raising in a public forum. And I think there's no question that building those nationwide groups where you can connect with people from different cities around the country dealing with similar issues is a really great way to access the best thinking and the best resources from various parts of the country. At the same time, I think the other thing we're going to see is there's still, I think you're right that there's not quite the maturity yet in the front range area that we see in New York City and in San Francisco for startups. And in short, I would say just wait 6 years. Because that was exactly what we were saying in New York City back in 2010, because there hadn't been a couple of rounds of companies to be built up, grown up. You get the millionaires roll out of it when there's a liquidity event, and then they start putting angel funds and some of their experience into the next round of startups. So I think we're really just a few years away from seeing an explosion of that, even if we didn't have talent coming from elsewhere, just purely based on homegrown experiences and wins. And then I think that's going to be particularly accelerated by the fact that we also have great talent, angel investors, product people, engineers, business and salespeople coming here from other markets so that we can kind of take those best practices and really build the next generation of Colorado startups.
Now, is CTO Connection limited to the different communities? Like, is there a Boulder CTO Connections and a New York City CTO Connection? Or once you've joined CTO Connection, do you have access to the entire network?
Yep, you have access to all members. So the goal, there are some things that work very well in person, and there are some things that work very well online. If you want to have a big, exciting, motivating event, it's much easier to get people in a room to get them excited about learning and connecting and making new contacts. So that's why we run summits in particular cities. Equally, there's something really nice about being able to sit down in person, perhaps over a breakfast or a dinner or an evening with a series of speakers. And so that's why we run the monthly CTO Connections, which are actually going to be rolling out over the next 3 months. But the challenge is you can't always get to those meetups at the time when you have a problem that you need to discuss or your time when you have a challenge you need to build. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that the best communities have these in-person activation events, but then have the ability to connect online with a much larger pool of people, both geographically in terms of availability, right? Even if you have a meetup of 400 people, maybe 50 of them are going to make it to a particular meeting. And so this gives you access to a much wider brain trust and the ability to then filter that down into smaller communities of interest. So once you connect with CTO Connection Boulder, you're also connected to the global network, as well as being able to say, hey, anyone want to go grab a drink on Poe Street tonight?
So who's the typical person that would come to CTO Connection? I mean, is this like a 1-2-man person startup, or is this larger, more mature technology organization?
That's a great question. So it's basically anybody who is responsible for engineering management and wants to get better at what they do. Now, there are self-selecting subgroups that go to some events rather than others. Generally, for example, we have a marquee summit at the NASDAQ in New York City every year, and it's like $1,000 to turn up and a lot more if you want to fly in there. And so that's mainly funded startups, because it's really hard to spend $1,000 on a conference if you're kind of self-funding with ramen noodle money. And it's also generally people who are more experienced in their career. And then we have other events like engineering leadership boot camps, which are primarily for people in their first 5 years of engineering leadership who are still really trying to figure out the foundations. But in terms of being engaged with the broader community, if you're technical and you run an engineering team or would like to shortly, you're a good fit for this, irrespective of the size or type of company you work for. So we have people working for huge organizations like Verizon or AT&T, and we have one-person consultants who are running their own business.
So do you ever have somebody with business experience come to CTO Connection to learn more about the technology and learn how to speak geek, so to speak?
And that's a great question. And it's funny you say it that way, because we do actually have a completely separate resource called Speak Geek. The challenge in terms of managing the communities is it turns out that often when I still remember this was back in New York, but I'm sure something similar happens here, that in the early days of the New York Tech Meetup, there were all these fascinating people who had a great combination of business and engineering skills. And it was a really great community. But eventually it became so big, all you had was you would see hordes of business people descending on the few developers, asking them if they'd go build their cool new idea for free. And so that kind of pushed out the engineers to find other places to hang out. So the CTO Connection is specifically for people who are technical. You don't have to be programming today, but you should be able to know what a pull request is and be able to do a code review if you had to. So that's just for engineering leaders who have a technical background. And that way it keeps out, not that we don't love them, but the recruiters and the business people and the other people that they don't necessarily want in that particular forum. But then what we do is we take all of the best ideas from the top engineering leaders and we build that into a standard curriculum, and we provide Speak Geek courses to teach business people how do you hire and manage these weird developers, and what are the things you have to do different to get the software you want and to attract the top engineering talent.
Probably nothing's more terrifying than have a bunch of business people come up to you in mass, asking you to build their next application or their next service, when you're just there to learn a little Ruby or Python.
Exactly. And it's tough because, I mean, clearly the ecosystem wouldn't exist. I consider myself to be an entrepreneur who happens to program. And the ecosystem would not exist without entrepreneurship. So I'm incredibly supportive of that. But it turns out that you get better and more authentic participation from engineers when you allow them to kind of get together in their own groups and have a safe space to talk about the issues that they're facing moving into engineering management.
So tell me about the lifelong learning philosophy you have and kind of how it applies to this situation.
Yeah, so the thing that really underlies CTO Connection, it started off as a couple of point solutions. How do we take engineers and teach them enough so they can go run a team without messing it up too bad? And it was actually very selfishly, how can I learn? I was running the engineering team at General Assembly at a time, a fast growth startup in New York City a few years ago. And I was like, I have no idea how to answer questions X, Y, and Z. And I had a lot of friends who were CTOs, but they weren't all going to grab a coffee with me and tell me all their lessons. So I said, how about if I get 150 engineering leaders in a room, would you come and speak at my conference? They said yes. And then the CTO summits were born back in 2014. So those were a couple of point solutions. But the more that I've looked at and thought about this problem, the question is, how do you build lifelong learning communities for professionals? We've got these point solutions. Oh, go attend a conference, go to a networking group, sign up for a training course, sign up for a video library online, Pluralsight or one of the others. But when it really comes down to it, what I want to do is build a community of people who are passionate about continuing to improve their craft. Initially, we're proving that out with engineering leaders, the craft of how do you hire, manage, and build amazing engineering organizations. But over time, I could imagine separate professional communities around digital media marketing or around community management or around sales management. And what I'm trying to do is build professional communities where people can really connect with and learn from their peers, find mentors and mentees, think about career development and see job opportunities, and have access to both foundational training resources and the very latest ideas from the top thinkers within their field.
When did you start CTO Connection?
So the work that I started doing that led up to it really started in 2011 when I started co-founded the CTO School in New York City. But CTO Connection itself was formed about a year and a half ago, just when I moved to Colorado. So it is a Colorado native and Colorado first company, and very proud to be so.
So were you able to use any of your existing connections in New York City to start this in Colorado?
Absolutely. It's a global business that happens to be based in Colorado. And one of the things that I think is really nice is that there's plenty of talent to both hire, to build a company here, and to just informally learn from and network with. But yet it's still it's a place that's not overwhelming, that gives you the space to really take the time to ask the hard questions. How do you build professional lifelong learning communities rather than jumping on the next biz dev opportunity or meeting? And so I really like that balance. So absolutely, this is leveraging connections I have around the world. We used to do CTO summits in Australia. We're looking to do some in London and in Europe next year. But it's still, this is a really nice home to be able to put all that together and to have the space to think about how to build a global brand.
So, Peter, what does the future of CTO Connection look like in the Front Range?
Well, in the Front Range, there's a number of things we're going to be doing. We're starting up new CTO Connections at the end of Q1 in both Boulder and Denver. We already had a CTO School, but we're changing the format to solve for a number of problems. CTO School sounded like something you only go to if you're starting to learn. And we wanted to create something that was more inclusive for everyone, from engineers looking to become engineering leaders right through to experienced CTOs looking to connect with their peers. So we're reformatting it now where there is some foundational content at the start of every monthly event. So an hour of presentations and engagement and facilitated discussion. And then we go into some presentations which are primarily for people who've been in the field a little longer, so that way people can come and go for different sections or stay for the whole experience, depending upon where they are in their career. So we're going to be rolling out the CTO Connections in Boulder and Denver, and then we're going to be doing a CTO Summit somewhere in the Front Range, probably something like Westminster, to make it accessible to everyone in the fall. We don't have exact dates, but same as the summits in New York and San Francisco, we're going to have between 18 and 20 top engineering leaders it's a full-day single-track event where you can learn very quickly lots of different perspectives on how to build teams, think about architecture, and succeed at really hiring and building an awesome engineering organization.
So it sounds like this would be a really good opportunity for somebody with solid technical skills. They're just looking to take their business to the next level through making connections or learning some more advanced leadership techniques.
That's exactly it. We don't, but it's not that some of the presentations aren't technical. We had Nick Rockwell, who is the CTO of the New York Times at the NASDAQ recently, present on the curious state of serverless architectures. And we had Mike, the CTO of Vimeo, give a presentation talking about how you can reduce your AWS costs and your costs across cloud hosting providers. So we do have broadly applicable technical content, but we're not going to do a whole bunch of talks on Python or Java or Scala or Elixir, because you can find that stuff anywhere. And most people who've built or managed an engineering team know that the hardest choice is not what programming language to use. The hardest decisions are, how do you differentiate yourself when Amazon and Google are hiring in the same market and offering twice the cash comp that you are? How can you engage people so that they are passionate about building the products that you need? We had a great talk from the CTO of Blue Apron about a year ago, who was talking about how do you get engineers to want to work for your company when they don't yet know you're a technology company. It's like Blue Apron, they just sell meals. Why would I want to work for a meal prep company? Turns out they actually have some fascinating underlying tech challenges, so it's a great place to work. But convincing people of that is a real challenge. So those are the kinds of talks that we typically have at these events. It's about solving the hard problems to build a large and successful engineering team.
It's interesting you talk about Blue Apron not being perceived as a technology company. I've thought the same thing about Uber. They're a ride-sharing company. Initially the question was, what's the technology platform there?
Well, it's interesting, because the very first thing is I heard about Uber fairly early on. And if there's one thing you should definitely take from this interview, it's never ask me for stock picking or startup picking advice, because I thought Uber was a terrible idea. And honestly, I really didn't get the value proposition for Google in the early days. I understood why I wanted to use them. I had no idea how they were going to make money. That said, it's really an easier way of rich white dudes getting town cars to and from SFO did not seem like a world-changing opportunity when I first saw it in those terms. I think it was clear fairly early on that once it became non-trivial, there were actually going to be real engineering challenges around it, because we actually need to know where the cars are, and we need to keep track of them, and then we need to display them on a map, but we need to do it with low latency. So there actually are some interesting engineering challenges that probably came in, once they went beyond just like having some human being sending emails to people. But you're right. It's the early days of a tech company. It's often hard to realize just how much tech there is underlying the business.
It's interesting to think about how much potential lies in large organizations that haven't really taken the time to innovate. A lot of the Fortune 500 companies that I've worked for, they'll have a VP of IT or they'll have a CIO, but unless they're an engineering-focused organization, you never find a CTO who's really carving out the strategic technology direction. The CIO is focused on day-to-day business operations, whereas the CTO is typically more focused on ensuring the best platform and ensuring product innovation.
Yeah, I think it goes back to Clayton Christensen and the innovator's dilemma, which is when you have success with doing something, you typically ossify around processes to make sure you keep doing more of that efficiently and don't do other things in case it breaks the thing that's working. It's why, for example, mobile adoption is in some ways lower in the US than in parts of the world where they have much less good traditional infrastructure, and so they depend on mobile because it's the only way of accessing information. And I think you run into the same thing with large companies, which is that they were very successful using a certain set of policies and procedures and operating plans and technologies in a point in time. And firstly, it's hard for them to risk that by disrupting what they do as an organization. And then secondly, they don't always have hiring practices or perks or opportunities that would attract the people who'd be excited to disrupt them. So I used to do a lot of enterprise training. I was a contract member of the GitHub training team. So I would teach engineers at many different companies, at fast growth startups, at small companies, and at large enterprises. And generally, you saw very different populations and very different incentive structures. Because the main goal in a big company is usually not to mess it up and get fired, whereas the main goal in a small company is usually we're going to be out of business if we don't make something work, so let's try some new stuff and see what we can figure out. Right.
I mean, they say nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, but nobody really did anything interesting after buying them for a while either.
At least until Watson. And now it will actually be interesting to see what their lead in AI is like and how they manage to commercialize that. Because not that IBM hasn't actually done many amazing things over the time, but I'm actually fascinated to see whether they will have a resurgence based upon some of the specific customer engagements they've been doing around AI.
I was reading the book, Thank You for Being Late, by Thomas L. Friedman. And he was talking about how the original Watson was the size of a bedroom. And the version they're on now is the size of a pizza box. And just the economies of scale that have really shrunk that technology into smaller and smaller packages. And now you even have those services in the cloud. So you have, Watson in the cloud that you can access with APIs. I think cloud computing is just such a shift in compute.
Definitely. I think when you think about cloud computing, what it does is it reduces the cost and cycle time for innovation. It was always possible to go build out a web server that would serve tens or hundreds of millions of customers, but it used to require 50 engineers. It used to require 3 months lead time for buying the parts, and then you needed to go to the colo facility and put your racks together and plug everything in and check the components and replace hard drives when they went down. Like back in the late 90s, building for scale was just hard. Now you just git push Heroku, which is the kind of magic command line to push your files to a particular hosting provider. And within a few minutes, you have the capacity to do all of that and more as a single developer. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about this is it really reduces both cycle time and cost for innovation. And then the limiting factor goes elsewhere. The limiting factor is now not your ability to raise substantial capital for building out an engineering team and a data center, but rather your capacity to grab attention, to build virality, to raise sufficient capital to do traditional marketing, whatever it is, to allow you to drive the audience you want. It's why when you see all the Steve Blank and the kind of Eric Ries lean startup stuff, the limiting factor now is not whether we can build it, Sure, we just spin up some EC2 instances on Amazon and we'll write some code. We can build it. The question is whether we should. And that's why design sprints and focusing on lean startup processes so that you can think, what's the quickest and easiest way to validate the underlying hypothesis that somebody's actually going to care if I really build this thing? And I think that's been a fascinating shift that's come about primarily because of the lowering in costs due to cloud computing and more productive languages and frameworks, things like Ruby on Rails and now Elixir and Phoenix.
As the tools get better and it gets easier to build things, there's such an increased load on engineering management teams to hold everything together and keep everybody marching in the same direction. Is that something that CTO Connection helps people address?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's fascinating to me is seeing how the topics at our various conferences change. And we use those to understand the biggest challenges people are facing and how we can then create foundational materials, both for business people through SpeakGeek and for younger engineering leaders trying to learn the basics. But there's no question that I think one of the biggest challenges is that everything is moving so much more quickly now. It's just harder to figure out, how do I prioritize? How do I make trade-offs between, unfortunately, we need to use JavaScript for pretty much anything we do. It's a part of the stack now. And the right way to serve up your files and kind of load everything up changes every 3 or 4 months. So do you completely change out your tech stack every quarter? If not, do you risk being both stuck with obsolete technologies and unable to attract cool developers because they don't want to work on an Angular app when they would rather work on React? And I think a lot of the challenges now are around how do you deal with this increasing pace of innovation and find the kind of Goldilocks point in the middle that keeps you far enough out on the curve so that you can attract the best developers and get the productivity gains, but not so far out on the curve that you're spending your entire life debugging somebody else's open source project. One of the best insights I got, and I'm so lucky that I get to interview and listen to so many very experienced engineering leaders from large, fast growth companies who've really been through this. One of the best distinctions I got was speaking with a friend recently who highlighted that when you move from engineering as an individual contributor to engineering management, you stop building software and you start building organizations. You're building culture, you're building information flows, you're building incentives. And in many ways, you are still building and creating something, but you need to understand that the thing you're creating is a social organization of people rather than the piece of software that happens to be generated by that team of people. And I think that's the biggest mind shift. And it's really a very elegant way of putting it because it then starts you thinking about obvious questions. Just as if I'm building software, what language should I use and what framework should I use and where should I host it and what design patterns should I use? It then leads you to questions about if I'm building this community, this organization, these collaborating people, what are the rules and heuristics that allow me to build that in a way that will be efficient and scalable and productive, just like I want my code to be? And I think by using metaphors like that, for the engineers moving into engineering management, it becomes much more accessible. We find ourselves using very different metaphors when we're doing the SpeakGeek content, because there, the last thing you want to do is think about talking about, the heuristics and the rules and the frameworks, but you just want to figure out how can you get these geeks to go build my software. And it's fascinating to me that an interesting part of this is really what are the right stories to tell and experiences to provide to help different people with a different background learn things they need to get great software built.
Yeah, it's all about learning how to connect with your audience and learning how to meet them where they are. So tell me more about the plans for the future groups.
Absolutely. One of the things we're excited about with building the CTO Connection community is we've got a collection of over 9,000 engineering leaders that we are kind of bringing into the community over the next 3 months, which is awesome because the larger the community, the easier it is to find people that share your specific interests, philosophies, and goals. So we really want to create a place where people can build their own subset communities of interest where they can be incredibly frank with small groups of people carefully chosen that they truly trust to connect with and learn from.
I think that's a great way to go about building out a community, especially with something like this. How can people find more information about CTO Connection?
We're building a lot of new things, but the easiest way is if they just go to ctoconnection.com. They can sign up for the mailing list, and there they will find out about new summits, new meetups in their areas, and the online community that we're rolling out in the next 3 months.
That sounds great. CTOconnection.com. I'm going to be going there as soon as we wrap this call and sign up. I think it's a great thing that you're doing, and I love the community aspect of it. Just having that network of people that you can turn to who have been there before and done things before. It's not always necessarily about how to write the code, but it's other lessons along the way that people can help you with.
And Trapper, thank you so much for taking the time. And thanks so much for building a podcast that allows us to build community and connect with other people doing fascinating things on the Front Range.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Colorado TechCast. To hear more episodes of this program, visit our website at coloradotechcast.com. There you'll find everything you need to know to subscribe to the show. We're also on Twitter at CO TechCast and love hearing your comments, so keep them coming. I'm Trapper Little, and I'll talk with you soon on the next episode of Colorado TechCast.